Poštovani gledatelji, povjesničari, ljubitelji povijesti, dobra vam večer. Prije 70 godina, 1945. proglašena je neovisnost Republike Indonezije. Od Sabanga do Merauke, kako je često u govorima isticao prvi predsjednik Ahmed Sukarno, od krajnjeg sjeverozapada Sumatre do krajnjeg jugoistoka zapadnog Irijana na 13.000 otoka, stvorena je jedna od najvećih nacija na svijetu. Indonežani su bili podanici Nizozemske do početka Drugog svjetskog rata. Potom su otocima vladali Japanci. Na samom kraju sukoba, 17.8.1945. nakon što su bačene atomske bombe na Japan, Sukarno je proglasio neovisnost, a on sam je proglašen predsjednikom Indonezije. Slijedio je 4-godišnji antikolonijalni sukob, jedan od razloga zašto se u zapadnim historiografijama povijest neovisne Indonezije pomicala na 1949. godinu. O povijesti nastanka Indonezije, o marhaenizmu, o novim snagama koje se rađaju, o najvećoj muslimanskoj naciji na svijetu govorimo u večerašnjoj trećoj povijesti.
Potkraj 16. stoljeća malena nizozemska ekspedicija pod zapovjedništvom Cornelisa de Houtmana dolazi u indonezijski arhipelag. Nizozemci su ubrzo prepoznali priliku u trgovini začinima, te 1602. zbog straha od engleske i portugalske konkurencije osnovana Nizozemska istočno-indijska kompanija. Iako pokrenuta isključivo radi trgovine, kompanija se postupno sve više upletala u političke intrige na terenu, pa je tako već u 18. stoljeću postojao niz vojnih baza i trgovačkih naselja duž sjeverozapadne obale otoka Jave. U 2 stoljeća postojanja kompanija je poslala više od 5000 brodova koji su prevezli otprilike 1 milijun Europljana na područje arhipelaga. Kompanija, koja je označila prvu fazu kolonijalnog projekta na području današnje Indonezije, konačno je propala 1800. zbog raširene korupcije, brojnih epidemija zaraznih bolesti i naglog pada isplativosti trgovine začinima.
Gost večerašnje treće povijesti je dr. Johanes Radjaban, direktor jezičnog centra Tehnološkog sveučilišta u Jogjakarti. Ja vam želim dobru večer.
Terima kasih, selamat malam, selamat petang.
Dr. Radjaban je isto tako i etnomuzikolog, pa osim što je prvi lektor indonežanskog jezika na Filozofskom fakultetu Zagrebačkog sveučilišta, za studente muzičke akademije predaje i instrumente iz Indonezije i sviranje nekih od indonežanskih instrumenata. Mr. Radjaban, you are the first lecturer of Indonesian at the University of Zagreb. What does it mean, Indonesian language? When you look at the vastness of Indonesian territory, how was it possible, or how is it possible to talk about one language?
The Indonesia, Bahasa Indonesia, or Indonesian language, is actually the former language of the Indonesian people, the Indonesian country. So the official language of the Indonesian country, or this country, is Bahasa Indonesia, or Indonesian language. It was introduced actually in 1928, when it was, at the first time, the word Bahasa Indonesia was introduced to the people. And that was the language. Starting from that point, the language became the first language for all nations that have more than 748 languages.
So out of these 748 languages, how different they are from each other, or some of them at least?
I could describe this, that when somebody talk using one language of their own, and they talk to the other people from the other areas, they completely could not understand one to the other. So there should be one language that should be created for all nations so that everybody in this nation, in this country, could understand. And at that time, it was Bahasa Indonesia, who was created from the basic one was from Malay language.
Okay, and that was during the colonial rule still. Whose idea it was?
It was the idea of what people called groups of young generations. They called themselves young Javanese people, young Ambonese people, young Sundanese, and so on. So they got together and they realized that they need one language to communicate. And at that time, they initiated to have one national language, that's Bahasa Indonesia, as the lingua franca of the people at the time.
Were there any natural speakers of the language that eventually became the lingua franca?
The native speakers of this language was the Malay language living in the area of Sumatra. So some parts of the Sumatran people were traders traveling in the area of most of Indonesian areas. They used this language. That's why most of the people having in touch with these traders, they could use the language. That's why this language became the lingua franca.
How many speakers of Indonesian today?
250 million people of the Indonesian people use the language. If we use Bahasa Indonesia and we talk to the people living in Malaysia, they could still understand that. And we talk to people, to people in the area of Brunei Darussalam, we can also communicate using this language, because this language is actually the language that is also used by Malaysian people and also Brunei Darussalam people. Yes.
You mentioned late 1920s. Before the Second World War, Jakarta, and in Jakarta there were the Dutch living and ruling with Indonesia. Could you describe the coming of the Dutch to your part of Asia?
They came especially for spices. They wanted to have the spices, that they want to organize how to trade spices, of course, to make them have a good way of trading. So they have to get their own spices from Indonesia. And after that, they conquered all of the areas that were ruled by the local kings and the local queens, because there were also some fights from the local kings and queens. So the Dutch tried to invite more troops from the Royal Indies companies, just to strengthen themselves, to have absolute power, just to control all of the trading, all of the collections of the spices. Because of the fall of the Dutch in Europe by the French troops, and then in January 1800, there was a declaration that the Dutch companies should leave Indonesia. Starting from January the 1st in 1800, then the Dutch changed the name. It's not big. It was formerly the Royal Dutch armies, the Royal Dutch companies, and then it becomes the Netherlands companies. And then starting from January the 1st, 1800, and then the Dutch colonizations became stronger and stronger.
When you mentioned the first date when the Dutch came, that was the peak of the Dutch state, one of the strongest, richest states in the world, even in spite of a relatively small size. But when you look at the size of the Indonesian territory, what kind of colonization it was? There weren't simply enough Dutch to make that land Dutch, yeah?
I could say that the Dutch is very clever. You know, the local kings were, they were not united yet. So when they came to the local areas, and then the Dutch tried to promise better power, wider areas for the local kings and queens. And when they were offered by the Dutch about the power and support, and then they accepted Dutch. And it's very easy for the Dutch to organize all of the tradings, all of the business in spices. Behind the scene, they also play how to organize the politics behind the king and queens, the local kings and queens. And using this time, using these strategies, the Dutch tried to apply what they called culture special. So they tried to influence the king and queens to always fight one to another. So their powers, the powers of the local king and queen, seems to be little and get weaker and weaker. So using these strategies, it seems that it worked very well. So basically, in terms of the authorities, the Dutch Indies government seems to could cover all of the areas of Indonesia. It seems to be quite wide.
Napoleonski ratovi doveli su do kratkog interludija u nizozemskoj kolonijalnoj avanturi. Ipak, nakon kratkotrajne francuske i britanske epizode, Nizozemskoj su 1815. godine vraćeni posjedi u Indoneziji. Sve izraženija kolonizatorska politika dovela je 1825. godine do Javanskog rata, u kojem se javanski princ Diponegoro odlučno suprotstavio Nizozemcima. Nakon početnih uspjeha pobunjenika, Nizozemci su 1830. ipak porazili Diponegorove snage. Te su godine Nizozemci pokrenuli veliki projekt takozvanog sustavnog kultiviranja, kojim je reformirana poljoprivreda i sustav zemljišnih prihoda. Taj će sustav potkraj 19. stoljeća zamijeniti takozvani liberalni period, a početkom 20. stoljeća etička politika. Takva politika zapravo je bila nizozemska varijanta doktrine koju je engleski pisac Rudyard Kipling nazvao bremenom bijelog čovjeka, a pretpostavljala je dužnost bijelaca da kultiviraju ostatak svijeta, no zapravo je opravdavala imperijalizam. Upravo su u tom razdoblju, zbog reformi koje su omogućile mnogim dobrostojećim obiteljima pristup europskom obrazovanju, stvoreni preduvjeti za pojavu prvih nacionalnih pokreta u Indoneziji.
At the beginning of 20th century, how present were the people from Europe? In what kind they were ruling with so many islands? Who were the governors, and what was the role of Dutch language or Dutch system in general?
Before 1928, like what I have said, there was no idea of Indonesia, because this area from Sabang to Merauke seems to be under the local kingdoms, and they are small kingdoms. So they organize their own areas, and they do not have power to cover all wider areas from Sabang to Merauke. Starting from the entrance of the Dutch companies, and the Dutch realized that the local kingdom seems to be quite weak, because they only organize certain limited areas. And from this point of view, and then the Dutch wants to have a kind of authority to cover all of the area of Indonesia from Sabang to Merauke. The Dutch influenced one king to fight against the other kings and to fight against the other kings by promising certain compensations, like smaller land or bigger power to certain areas, and then they could rule all over the areas. And at that time, Dutch language seems to be quite popular, because everybody, especially the noble people of the local kingdoms, speak the language.
Mm-hmm. Was it common for the elite, the indigenous elite,
Yes.
to go and to study in the Netherlands?
Only the noble people, I mean the prince and princess of the local kingdoms, could study in the Netherlands. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But not the common people, of course.
Father of future President Sukarno was also a teacher.
Right.
In what kind of school was he teaching? Was he then teaching in Dutch too?
Yes. At the time, the school is only organized by the Dutch. So he was also the teacher in the Dutch school. And that's why Sukarno could get good educations. Not because he was from noble family, but because of his father. Because his father was a teacher in a very famous Dutch school in Java. So Sukarno and also the other siblings could also attend the schools. And from that, Sukarno could get good educations from the school. And that's why he could have knowledge about the world and also about freedoms and things about that.
Mm-hmm.
Dramatične promjene u svijetu nakon Prvog svjetskog rata utjecale su i na razvoj antikolonijalnih pokreta. U Indoneziji se javljaju dvije karizmatične ličnosti. Sukarno, koji 1926. u Bandungu osniva Indonezijski nacionalni savez, i Mohammad Hatta, koji početkom 30-ih formira pokret Indonezijsko nacionalno obrazovanje. Iako su Sukarno i Hatta imali različite poglede na određena politička pitanja, obojica su se zauzimala za nezavisnost, a tih je godina i prvi put jasno politički postavljena ideja Indonezije kao države. Zbog njihova agitiranja u međuratnim godinama, nizozemske su im vlasti u nekoliko navrata sudile i zatvarali ih. Sudske procese Hatta i Sukarno iskoristili su za širenje svojih ideja, te su ubrzo postali poznati po cijelom arhipelagu. Ipak, do početka Drugog svjetskog rata, nizozemske su vlasti uspjele donekle neutralizirati njihov utjecaj i činilo se da je nacionalni pokret izgubio inicijativu. U takvu stanju prividne letargije Indonezija će dočekati početak Drugog svjetskog rata.
The proposal to start with a lingua franca, which was actually a very smart idea, how otherwise to connect that many islands, how it was treated by the Dutch colonial authorities? Were they aware that that might be maybe also useful for them, but also relatively dangerous.
Yeah. The idea of having this great lingua franca as the national language is the first reason is for political reasons. The idea is to unite all of the young people at the time. At that time, young people from all over Nusantara. It was the Nusantara is the Indonesian words to indicate or to say about Indonesia now. It means archipelago. So the young people from all over the archipelagos came to Sumatra at the time to have an agreement because they realized that they need unity, and one of them is through language. So they realized that they have to create one language as the language for them to communicate one to another. Of course, the Dutch colonizer or the Dutch government at the time seems to be very resistant to this one, because they realized that based on this idea they could then be stronger, because this language might unite this big area of Nusantara at the time. But that could not be avoided, because it's not about political movement. It's just about what we say cultural movement. So it's not about endangering the power of the Dutch directly. But of course, the idea behind this is for that point, for that purpose. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Big change in Indonesian and history of the whole world came with the beginning of the Second World War. So Indonesia was attacked by the Japanese Imperial Army, and the whole world changed. So what happened in Jakarta with the Dutch at the beginning or at the end of 1941, and what happened with the Indonesians, how the Japanese were treated?
At that time, the Dutch was surrendered because of the invasions of the Japanese troops. And also all of the authorities should leave Indonesia. And starting from that point, Japanese troops have the power or seize this country. And Jakarta at that time was ruled by the Japanese troop, the Japanese government. And even it lasts only for 3 years, but it was the worst period to the Indonesian people. People say iron hand, so no mercies. So people in Indonesia, especially in Jakarta, could not even get the stronger power to fight against the Japanese troop at that time. And then the Indonesian powerful people and also influential people like Sukarno and also Hatta and also Sahrir got the idea that it was the time for Indonesia to proclaim the independence as a free country, as independent nations. And that's true. But even though there were some small incidents before that, but finally Sukarno and Hatta proclaimed the independence of Indonesia.
Japanske snage u siječnju 1942. napale su Indoneziju. U munjevitoj kampanji Japanci su u samo 2 mjeseca zauzeli Borneo i Sumatru, a 8. ožujka predale su se i posljednje nizozemske snage na Javi. 2 najvažnija indonezijska političara, Sukarno i Mohammad Hatta, odabrali su put suradnje s Japancima. Takva politika omogućila je Sukarnu da postupno pripremi snažnu poziciju za konačan obračun s kolonijalizmom nakon završetka rata. Tako je 1943. osnovan Centar narodne pomoći, poznat po akronimu Putera, čiji je službeni cilj bila pomoć Japanu, a zapravo je Sukarnu omogućio stvaranje Ujedinjene fronte, koja je mobilizirala sve snage političkog spektra u Indoneziji. Također, iste godine pod nazivom Zaštitnici domovine oformljena platforma putem koje je do kraja rata gotovo 2 milijuna Indonežana dobilo osnovnu vojnu obuku.
What was Sukarno during the war? Where was he physically during the war?
We could say that Sukarno have a very intelligent way of communicating. So in terms of political communications, he was the master at that time. So he could communicate to all of the Indonesian warriors at that time, just to follow the idea of national movement. So the idea of Sukarno seems to be the idea that most of the Indonesian warriors believe. So actually Sukarno did not fight physically. Sukarno was in Jakarta and moved to Surabaya and also the other areas of Indonesia just to get the idea of, or to plan stronger idea of building nations. And that's what Sukarno did.
Were the Japanese aware of his role?
Sure. That's why Sukarno was often sent to jail or was exiled to certain places because of that. But again, that Sukarno also seems to be quite smart in terms of finding supports from the international countries. Like, for example, from Soviet Union at that time, and also from the areas of the world. Because of that pressure, and then Japanese troops should release Sukarno. And when he could get that, and then Sukarno organized again how to build the national, or the nation building to build the nation.
How come he became the organizer? What was his role in the 30s, before the Second World War? Was he a public figure in Indonesia, or?
People said that Sukarno had the characters, or people say charisma. So when Sukarno talk, when Sukarno speak, everybody listens to him, including the leaders of the warriors, including the kings, the local kings. They listened to Sukarno. So we could not explain what he gave to them, but I think based on his great rhetorics. So his rhetoric seems to be very powerful to influence people, not only to influence, but to believe in him, and even to rely on him. That's what he did, actually. So when he talk, when he speak, no one just reject or refuse, up to the end of his power.
We started with the fact that Indonesia is celebrating the 70th anniversary because independence was proclaimed in 1945. But what happened? It wasn't that easy, So you had the proclamation of independence, but then also fighting continued. When
Japan surrendered to the Allied forces on the 14th of August in 1945, Sukarno and friends just forced the Japanese authority at the time to give the independence to Indonesia. But the Japanese authority at the time did not want to give that. By giving Sukarno and also the leaders at the time to think of it, to prepare the Indonesians' independence. By doing this, hopefully that the Sukarno and the leaders at that time focus on the preparations of the independence, and the Japanese people just could build the power or rebuild the power to conquer Indonesia again.
Sukarna i Hatu je tijekom rata osobno odlikovao japanski car Hirohito, a potkraj rata Japanci su sve glasnije govorili o proglašenju indonezijske nezavisnosti. Ipak, to se nije dogodilo. Već su nakon bacanja atomskih bombi na Hirošimu i Nagasaki, mladi militanti oteli Hatu i Sukarna, te ih 17. kolovoza natjerali da proglase nezavisnost.
The young generations forced Sukarno just not to believe in what Japanese have already promised to him. Just try to declare the independence at this time. Sukarno and Hatta and also the leaders at that time were kidnapped between quotation marks. Were kidnapped and taken to one small city that is called Rengas Dengklok because the young people want to force Sukarno. And at the night before the independence proclamations, Sukarno were sent back to Jakarta. Sukarno and friends were sent back to Jakarta, and in the morning, at about 10 in the morning, and then Sukarno proclaimed the independence.
Where that happened?
In the house of Laksamana Maida. Why? Because Sukarno at the time was sick. So some people said that the Indonesian's proclamation was the proclamations from the bedroom, because at that time Sukarno was sick and he got very high fever. But at that time, Sukarno was pushed to proclaim. So even though he was sick, and then he wrote himself the proclamation text together with Hatta, and then exactly at 10 in the morning, Sukarno proclaimed the independence of Indonesia. Mm-hmm. And at the time, no preparations at all, because that even the Indonesian national flag was taken from somebody's clothing, and then tried to tear it and tried to match the red color and the white color, and the wife just snatched it. And at that time, that's the national flag. So it was not planned at all. Just like it comes immediately on the spot like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But that wasn't the end. The proclamation came,
Yeah.
but it wasn't de facto recognized by some very important political players.
Sure.
The Dutch returned, and how was that explained? How do Indonesians explain those events that followed today?
After the proclamations on the 17th of August, and then Sukarno and Hatta built a cabinet, and Sukarno was the president and Hatta was the vice president at the time. And based on this full cabinet, and then Sukarno tried to rule Indonesia, tried to govern Indonesia with his own cabinet. Even though Dutch and the other important countries like Japan did not recognize this government. But because of this point, and then Sukarno tried to show to the world, to the international world, that, okay, Indonesian government as a free nations existed. When the Dutch came together with the elite forces from Surabaya, and then tried to take back the authorities from Sukarno, and they tried to recolonize. They took Jakarta, and then tried to show to the world that the Indonesian government did not exist any longer. And that's what happened to the Dutch. But Sukarno and also the government at the time, the cabinet, were moved to Yogyakarta by the king of Yogyakarta, Sultan Hamengkubuwono IX. Because of this point, and then Sukarno and the cabinet could still exist. And regularly the king of Jogja tried to inform the international world that the government of Indonesia existed. At that time, the Indonesian troop, the Indonesian army, as the first army of Indonesia, could still exist, could still fight against the elite forces. And from this fact, the world recognized that the Indonesian government still existed. So from this point, that's why on the 27th of December 1949, the United Nations just declared that Indonesia existed.
What was the position of local rulers during the Japanese time? Were they still in their palaces, or?
The local kings and also the noble family, they live in their kingdoms, and the Japanese troops and also the Dutch troops could not touch them. They have their own authorities. So Japanese ruler and also Dutch rulers could only organize or could only rule the areas which are not or which did not belong to the kingdoms. Without the help of this king, Hamengkubuwono IX, I thought that Indonesia will not be a free country like this, because at the time when the elite forces came again, and the Dutch also came to take over the Indonesian's government. So within the kingdom of Yogyakarta, the Yogyakarta Palace, and then Indonesian government at the time, led by Sukarno and Hatta, ruled the area of Indonesia. And still from this place, the international world knew that the Indonesian government still existed. So based on this important role to the Indonesian government, this also made Yogyakarta as a special region up to now. So in 1949, based on the Indonesian law, Yogyakarta has a special positions in the Indonesian country up to now. Up to now. So the king is also the ruler or is also the governor. So we do not have elections for the area of Yogyakarta because the king is the ruler. Even the king belongs to Indonesia as a state, as a government, but the rule, how to rule Yogyakarta is still under the king. So we do not have the elections for the governor, for example, only for Yogyakarta.
How do Dutch historians look at this period from 45 to 49 today? What about the date of the independence? What do they consider as the real independence of...
Of course, the Dutch and the international world considered the 27th of December 1949 as the Indonesian independence, because at that time, it was the time when the world recognized or acknowledged the Indonesian independence, especially at the time when the UN, the United Nations, just declared that Indonesia was a free country, a free nation. But Indonesian people themselves did not care about the second proclamations because they believe in Sukarno. They were proud of the first proclamations. That seems to be de facto as the Indonesian independence.
Budimir Lončar svoju je veleposlaničku karijeru započeo u Indoneziji, gdje je tu dužnost obnašao 1965. do 1969. Bio je četvrti jugoslavenski veleposlanik u Indoneziji. Sukarno je upoznao 1960. tijekom zasjedanja Opće skupštine Ujedinjenih naroda, a na mjesto veleposlanika je postavljen u trenutku kada su turbulentna zbivanja već zahvatila Indoneziju. Na toj poziciji bio u posljednje dvije Sukarnove te prvim godinama Suhartove vladavine.
Sukarno je bio i političar 20. stoljeća i moderni sultan, jedno i drugo. On se je na domaćem terenu stalno ipak profilirao, reproducirao kao sultan, prosvjetitelj koji je cijeli svoj život posvetio slobodi svog naroda i stvaranju jedne jedinstvene zajedničke i to unitarne države. Ako se pođe od toga i nema sumnje da je na međunarodnom planu bio iz tog izvodio svoj pogled na svijet, ali je on stalno anticipirao brze promjene u svijetu. I on je govorio da on neće dugo živjeti, a i nije dugo živio, umre u 72. godini, doduše u zatočeništvu, što nije sigurno očekivao. Za njega se kaže da je tvorac, da je otac nove nezavisne Indonezije. On je zemlju od 17.000 otoka sa samo 5.600 napućenih, zemlju od tada 160 miliona, tada je bila peta na svijetu po veličini, sad je četvrta, ima 250 miliona, više nema Sovjetskog saveza, napravio ne samo jednom državom, nego je dao jedan identitet. I njegova je bila glavna, najprije u prvoj fazi preokupacija, da napravi jedinstvenu državu kroz tri elementa. Prvo kao nezavisnu antikolonijalnu tvorevinu, drugo da je dade osjećaj zajedništva i po mogućnosti prihvaćanje unitarne države, i treće da joj izgradi identitet, naročito zajednički jezik.
If someone talks about Sukarno, you can approach him from so many different angles and period while he was ruling with Indonesia. What is Marhaenism? What kind of ideology, idea that was?
At that time, the influence of capitalism represented by the seems to be quite strong. And also, you know, the socialism supported by the Soviet Union was also very strong. And Sukarno appreciated both of these isms, but he didn't want to join one or the other. So he tried to build his own idealism that is called Marhaenism. He even could accept capitalism, but he could not fully accept capitalism. He accepts socialism, but he did not accept socialism as a full conception. So he tried to build his own nationalism in the forms of Marhanism that was very famous up to now even. So the Marhanism by Sukarno is very famous in Indonesia up to now.
Sukarno was coming with different concepts and paroles and ideas for touching very many different fields of life in Indonesia. But one that was relatively controversial was the concept of the new emerging forces. What's that?
Fighting against capitalism was impossible. And fighting against socialism was also impossible at the time. So, but Indonesia needed to survive. So Indonesia need both of these two isms. So building the new ism, Marhanism, hopefully that Indonesia could just not fight, but he said like, for example, he said like this, we should live like fish in the very high tide and stream. So if we fight against the streams, we will die. But the fish could just swim even in a very high tide. So that's the idea of building the new troops of Indonesia from Sukarno. And up to now it is known as what we know as a silent resistance. We fight but silently. It's just like a fish swimming in the very high tide.
U Bandungu na Javi u travnju 1955. na prvoj afroazijskoj konferenciji okupili su se predstavnici 29 država. Bio je to prvi pravi sastanak lidera Trećega svijeta. U uzavreloj atmosferi hladnog rata zemlje predstavljene u Bandungu pokušale su, unatoč svojim raznim ideologijama i savezništvima, upozoriti na probleme dekolonizacije, rasizma i razoružavanja, kao i na potrebu za većom kulturnom i ekonomskom suradnjom. Među brojnim uzvanicima posebno se isticao domaćin Sukarno, čiji se govor o potrebi za jedinstvom Trećega svijeta i danas smatra vrhuncem konferencije.
One of the very important dates when we refer to what eventually became the movement of the non-aligned countries was a conference of Asian, de facto Asian and a few African, because there were only a few independent African states at the time, the conference in Bandung in 1955. How important that still is or resonates to the Indonesian political life?
It's still very important up to now. And the moment in 1955 in Bandung seems to have a very magical power. I said magical power, just to unite the national need or to unite the national priority for the Indonesian development up to now.
Maybe you could explain a little bit one of the major or big crises that were evolving at the beginning of the 60s with the founding of independent Malaysia. What happened? What kind of war almost erupted between two neighboring countries at that time?
Sukarno at the time was very powerful politically because he was very influential in the international world, especially after the first Allied movement in Bandung. And because of the power of Sukarno that seems to grow bigger and bigger at the time, so the people, the Malaysian people and Malaysian government seems to get a bit worried about the idea of invading Malaysia, especially the area of Malaysia that seems to be in the same island in Borneo. And based on that point, critical moments happen. When incidents happen, like for example the Indonesian troops were killed by the Malaysian troop, and also the Malaysian troops were shot by Indonesian troops. At that point, we remember that 2 Indonesian pilots were sentenced to death by the Malaysian government, and that made Sukarno mad. And at that point, Sukarno said that we should destroy Malaysia.
Posljednjih godina na vlasti Sukarno se sve više radikalizirao. Bjesnio je zbog stvaranja Malezije 1963. zašto je okrivljavao Britance. Nakon kratkotrajnog sukoba s Malezijom ubrzo je pokrenuo protubritansku i protuameričku kampanju, a 1965. čak je povukao Indoneziju iz Ujedinjenih naroda. Sve češće je govorio o potrebi stvaranja novog savezništva s Kinom, Sjevernom Korejom, Kambodžom i Sjevernim Vijetnamom, koje je nazivao osovina Peking, Phnom Penh, Hanoj, Pyongyang, Džakarta. Tako je u posljednjih nekoliko godina svoje vladavine i na međunarodnom planu Sukarno izgubio teško stečene pozicije i otvorio prostor svojim političkim neprijateljima.
Imao je moć komunikacije s običnim čovjekom, sa različitim tim dijelovima Indonezije. To je bio jedan izuzetno sposoban komunikator. Imao je retoriku jaku i narod ga je prihvatio kao vođu, kao tvorca. Naravno, on za sebe kaže da je veliki, čak je rekao, ekstremni nacionalista na domaćem planu, a da je na svjetskom planu svjetski revolucioner. Naravno, te dvije stvari možda djeluju da su u sukobu, ali on to upravo pokušavao da pretvara u jedan svoj koncept pogleda na Indoneziju, njenu ulogu i na svijet. On je volio zabavu, volio je pjesmu. A to je inače narod koji voli pjevat, koji voli umjetnost, koji voli opuštenost. Pa je, recimo, učinio i to da bi na toj liniji izgradnje jednog jezika kao ključnog elementa u stvaranju jedne nacije, on je podijelio iz državnog budžeta radio svim familijama u Indoneziji. Tako da su i ovi ljudi koji nisu imali tako ni krov nad glavom, ali su slušali radio.
Za svoje vladavine Sukarno je stalno eksperimentirao i vješto balansirao između najsnažnijih grupacija u zemlji, komunista, vojske i islamističkih skupina. Tako je 1959. uveo vladanje predsjedničkim dekretom, a 1960. raspušten je parlament i formiran novi, za koji je on sam izabrao polovicu zastupnika. Vladao je izrazito autokratski, usmjerenom demokracijom, a 1960. postavio je i ideološki okvir svoje vladavine, takozvani nakon. Ta je složenica značila nacionalizam, religija i komunizam. Na kraju je upravo zbog tog balansiranja Sukarno svrgnut s vlasti. Početkom 60-ih vojni je vrh sve više zabrinjavalo jačanje komunista.
Taj puč je ostao sporan po svom karakteru i po svojim izborima. Kad se to dogodilo? To se dogodilo kad je Indonezija bila približavala se Kini, a u Kini je tada bila u punom jeku kulturna revolucija. Tada je postao već sukob između Kine i Sovjetskog saveza i naravno to je bilo vrijeme kad je kulminirao Vijetnamski rat i kad je bilo već vidljivo da Amerika neće moći da se izvuče iz tog rata kao pobjednik, nego kao strana koja će biti na neki način, ako ništa drugo, moralno politički poražena. U takvom kontekstu je on pokrenuo ideju novih snaga koje se rađaju. I njegova je stvar zatle kulminirala upravo tih godina, jer je bilo najavljeno da će izvršiti probu atomske bombe skupa sa Kinom. I to je izazvalo sukob sa nekim vojnim krugovima i tu je zapravo početak otpora njemu. Pošto je Komunistička partija Indonezije nije bila u vlasti, ali u parlamentu je bila, ona njemu davala podršku, ali nije bila dio izvršne vlasti. Izvršnu vlast je predstavljala vojska. I taj kup koji se dogodio kad su ubijeni 4 generala, onda je vojska to uzela kao povod i naravno navijestila je rat svim onima koji su je svrstavala pod lijevu opciju, pre svega KP Indonezije. I tada se postavilo pitanje, zapravo ti generali koji su ubijeni, ne znam se ko ih je ubio, i oni su to htjeli po svaku cijenu da se to pripiše Komunističkoj partiji, što se nije moglo dokazati. Poginulo je preko 500 milijuna ljudi. Svako ko je bilo kakve veze imao sa tom Komunističkom partijom Indonezije je bio čak nikakvu idejnu, nego po srodstvu. Onda se to prelilo u obračun inače lokalnih antagonizama. Tako da je to jedna velika tragedija koja je zapravo računa se između pola i 1 milijuna ljudi poginulo.
Kada su u svibnju 1965. komunisti najavili formiranje vlastitih snaga, vojska je svrnula Sukarna i na čelo države dovela generala Suharta. Ono što se činilo kao klasičan puč, ubrzo se pretvorilo u pokolj komunista, te je u iduće 2 godine u antikomunističkim čistkama ubijeno više od 500.000 ljudi.
Ja sam je tamo, da, ali je taj pokolj tako širom Indonezije vršio da je to bilo užasno, jer je bilo nemoguće vidjeti to sve skupa uslijed vojnog, odnosno zabrane kretanja. Kasnije je Sukarno mene stalno tražio za savjete, pa me tako u jednom času, kad je bio u najtežoj situaciji, pozvao i rekao je da bi želio da se vidimo. Naručio me u 6 sati ujutro, obično kad je važne susreti razgovorimo ih održava ujutro rano, 5-6 sati. I tako se mene protokol obavijestio navečer da me sutra čeka u palači. Ja sam došao u palaču u 15 do 6, on je izašao van, on bio vrlo galantan. Koliko god je bio autoritaran, ali je bio u ophodnji vrlo neposredan, topao, neformalan. I odbio me pod ruku za stol i sjeli smo. On sam ga pitao, a kakvi su njegovi odnosi sa Suhartom? Kaže, on je moj čovjek. Ja s njim koordiniram stvari. Sution i ostali generali nisu moji prijatelji, ali ima među generalima koji me ne podržavaju. Međutim, on ne shvaća situaciju, on je, kaže, dosta čovjek uskih pogleda i to je za mene problem. I kad mi je to rekao, ja sam vidio da on zapravo nije svjestan svoje situacije.
Sukarno je ostao zapaženi kao veliki vođa Trećega svijeta. Bio je jedan od inicijatora Bandunga, a poslije jedan od najzapaženijih lidera u pokretu nesvrstanih. Njegova originalna teorija bila je ona o novim snagama u usponu, koja je na određeni način označila radikalni zaokret od politike nesvrstavanja. Sukarno je smatrao da s jedne strane stoje nove snage Azije, Latinske Amerike, socijalističkih zemalja i progresivnih pokreta na zapadu, a s druge stare snage reakcionarnog zapada. Uz kinesku pomoć 1963. godine održane su čak i međunarodne igre novih snaga u usponu.
What happened, maybe just to close this conversation up with, what was the destiny of President Sukarno?
Sukarno, in fact, was a great man, a great Indonesian leader. And not because of his power, but because of his idea, especially the idea of building good nations based on his own construction. Like he introduced the basis of Indonesia, like Pancasila. And also he introduced the idea of Marhaenism that seems to be quite up to date up to now. Even the ruling party now is also based on these principles. I think Sukarno will be still the great person because of not only because of his role in the Independence Day, but also in the way he introduces new way of life, like for example non-aligned movement, and also what I call the silent resistance way of fighting against the very powerful wave of capitalism up to now.
Do you think you mentioned some very small groups? Do you think that is the idea that such a large nation as Indonesia, is it a suitable ideology for such a large nation? Do you think that that's maybe forbidden or preventing you to play even more important role on the international scene?
I think these two groups of people that were very small in the US and also in Dutch seems to be the idea why Sukarno introduced this idea to Indonesian people that seems to be quite big. He realizes very well that Indonesia is very rich of natural resources. Indonesia is very rich of manpower. Indonesia does not need many things imported from different countries. Why don't we live by ourselves, making use of the Indonesians' wealth Like, for example, we are rich of mining products. We are very rich of natural resources like fish, like also the dense rainforests in almost all of the Indonesian areas. So based on the idea, we could live by ourselves, actually. That's why he always said berdikari. We stand on our own feet. That's the idea of Marhainism.
Dr. Radjaban, thank you very much for this conversation.
Sure, you're welcome.
Poštovani gledatelji, evo toliko o nastanku jedne od najvećih nacija na svijetu, ali čini mi se i razgovoru koji je osim ove povijesne dimenzije pokazao i mentalitet stanovnika Indonezije. Hvala vam lijepa na pozornosti. Doviđenja.